Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10th class in the Basics of Marxism course, part of the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis, Marxism School. Tonight is a really exciting night for us, for both me and the class. Over the last 9 weeks, we've been learning all of the basic tools of Marxism, what it takes to do our own Marxist analysis rather than be sort of limited to just memorizing and repeating the conclusions of Marx or Lenin or Engels or whomever. We're going to take all of that knowledge we've learned over the last 9 weeks and apply it today. And we're going to together analyze today's USA by going over my own theory that's part of the Institute's contribution to American Marxism, something we call reproletarianization. We're going to do this class a little differently than all the rest, but also in a combination of those. So the first few classes, all of the class read short essays together, and we were encouraged to sort of interrupt each other, tell each other to hold on, let's focus on this part, let's ask questions, etc. as we went because they were short. Then as the content got a little more difficult, we read on our own, and I did some lectures, and we had group conversations about those lectures. So tonight, we're going to sort of do a mixture. I'm going to be reading some bits and pieces of my pamphlet on reproletarianization, which is focused on why there has been no socialist revolution in the US and class analysis of the last 100 years of our history. So I'll be reading bits and pieces of that. We'll be discussing it together and applying our dialectical materialist analysis. And we're going to do all of that right after this. Welcome back, everyone. Man, that intro gets me every time, every single time. I love it. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone, please, seriously, I know you're probably sick of hearing me say it by now. Hit the little like button, the subscribe button, the notification bell if you're watching at home or, wherever you are. We get algorithmic suppression. We're censored left and right. Every little bit genuinely helps. If you want to help a little bit more, patreon.com/MidwesternMarx, or you can go to our Buy Me a Coffee or Selfie store. Help us out. The entire Basics of Marxism class is brought to you guys free because what's really important is getting this Marxism out there and helping all of us educate each other. All that being said, we're going to rip right into it unless anybody in the class has any questions. If you do, feel free to raise your hand, let us know. While we're giving that a second, I notice one of the other co-directors of the Institute is here. Hello, Carlos, and pleasure to see you, brother.
Likewise, brother. I'm looking forward very much to your presentation, and I've had a chance to read the manuscript, and it's just terrific, very necessary stuff for our moment, and it elucidates a lot of the transformations in class and technological developments that force us to reassess things anew and help us provide clarity in a very in a time that's very easy for things to become obscure. So I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Speaking of obscure, thank you, by the way. Speaking of obscure, if the way I'm talking seems obscure to you, feel free, anyone in the class, to interrupt me, ask me to slow down, ask a question, etc. Otherwise, raise a hand. We can stop. We will keep going from there after we, answer your question. If you want to contribute and help with your own analysis, please do so as well. That's what we're doing here tonight. And I see there's one remark already. What's up, Sam?
I'm hating before you're even starting. No, I was just curious. This weekend, I tried to look for the pamphlet. Is it yet to be published? That I might have missed that.
Correct. It is not out yet. It's in the first round of edits right now, and there's some back and forth within the Institute on whether to make it a larger book project or this single pamphlet on its own to be extended later. There's a few, not to get into the nitty gritty, I'm very adverse to the academic style of writing. However, sometimes it's necessary. And so there's a lot of sort of evidence and things like this that are listed but not cited, if that makes sense. So it's a lot of just, nuts and bolts kind of stuff. Everything is there. The writing is there. But we're just building it up into what it will be.
Gotcha. I was only curious because I started reading some fellow named Carlos Garrido's book. And in the first page of some forthcoming titles, I won't spoil it, but one of your works is mentioned in there, and I was just curious as to about this specific one. But awesome, I look forward to it, and I'm all set to learn about it.
All right, well, let's learn about American history. The U.S. has a really long and rich revolutionary tradition, right? It's a tradition that is mostly hidden from us now in the 2020s, going untaught in schools and kicked to the margins of popular culture, but it stretches all the way back to before even the founding of the Republic. This is a country of Thomas Paine, isn't it? The country of W.E.B. Du Bois, Henry Winston, Martin Luther King Jr., Eugene Debs, Hannah Strong, Sojourner Truth, William Z. Foster, and Harriet Tubman. A country of heroes, a country of struggles, of a constant, ongoing battle for the unity of the people against those who would keep us divided, keep us segregated, and keep us scrounging in the muck, wasting the majority of our lives, toiling to make them rich. Yet through all of this, in over 100 years after the development of industrial capitalism, we've still somehow not produced a socialist revolution, even while countries all over the world, somewhat far less of a revolutionary tradition, have done just that. This fact leads us, it leads us to a really big question, possibly the biggest question of our era. What's up with that? Seriously, though, what's up with that? Why is it that the people who achieved independence from the British Empire smashed and destroyed the slavocracy and overthrew legalized segregation and Jim Crow, the people Karl Marx's own self said that the working class of Europe looked to as the future, cannot seem to produce a socialist revolution? We produced so much, struggled so long, and yet the financial cartels still rule. They still destroy society around us, impoverish our families and our children, and march us steadily to the brink of a possible nuclear war. Why can the American working masses not seem to get our proverbial shit together and get this thing done? It's a good question, right? Over the decades, we've seen dozens, if not hundreds, of different answers to this question, ranging from sensible guesses that arise from mistakes in ideology, like blaming everything on the media and anti-communist propaganda, or one-sided metaphysical errors that reduce the USA to only bourgeois barbarity of the past, right? To reactionary and absurd notions about immigration to the US preventing revolutionary potential. What we're going to try to do with the theory of reproletarianization is set the record straight by returning to Marxism for our answers, because it is precisely Marxism that has been missing in all of the responses above, and many of the academia going around that gets at this question today. While they oftentimes will have plenty of data and good analysis, without that Marxist foundation, there's always something missing. And before anyone watching this goes off about Marxism already being everywhere, let me explain. As we've been learning in this class, right? Over the last period of American history, the word Marxism has been incredibly distorted to Westerners and to Americans in particular. And I'm not just talking about wrong mistakes or ideas here, mistakes in ideology, but a consolidated effort by the ruling class to create an anti-communist left movement that's not only safely compatible with bourgeois society, but downright counter-revolutionary. A left that filters potential revolutionary forces into these safe, compatible places. A movement that can sound revolutionary in its language and rhetoric, but in substance, it's the direct ideological derivative of modern bourgeois liberalism. As we've been learning, Marxism is not what we hear about in the media, right? It's not what a lot of people who tell us they're Marxists will tell us. This fake left, for lack of a better word, whether it realizes it or not, gets its cues from the ruling class. The manufactured movement is called left as it has a surface level appearance that's similar to the old left and uses a lot of terms borrowed from the kind of things we've been learning in this class, but it's a movement that finds itself not in the soil of the American proletariat and working masses, but instead in that of the large middle classes of the last period. And I'm going to go over the rest of this part briefly, but basically in the absence of a powerful communist party, right? A fact that's intensified with the collapse of the Soviet Union or some similar organization to ground the left in revolutionary classes, this new left found its home in college campuses, bourgeois NGOs and think tanks, in suburbs and gentrified metropolises, and not in the factories, mills, and warehouses that the old left was at home in. The difference in class composition of this left is felt throughout society. This left, educated in the finest institutions the bourgeois knowledge production apparatus has to offer, alienates the working masses of its own country and continually finds revolutionary sounding phraseology to say the exact same things that the ruling class says. It don't matter how many times they say dialectical if they're not approaching a problem dialectically. And it don't matter how nice and revolutionary the words they use sound, if the direct, concrete implications of them in practice contribute to strengthening capitalism and not to disclosing its contradictions and advancing the class struggle against it. If the class remembers from last week, this is what Stalin was telling us, right? That just because the proletariat was that developing class in society, the Marxists focus on this, not because of, words that sound nice, right? The world outlook of the pseudo-left, which they'll sometimes even call Marxism, has nothing whatsoever to do with the actual world outlook that we've been learning over the past weeks. It has nothing to do with our own revolutionary thinkers like Du Bois or Wedemeyer. It is instead, as our friend Carlos here noted, an outlook of purity fetishization. And this purity fetish finds them unable to understand American history or its most important moments. If we can't understand the Second American Revolution, the Civil War and Reconstruction, then we can't understand the third, the political revolution we call the Civil Rights Movement. And if we can't understand the third revolution, then we can't understand the rise of the middle classes, which means we can't understand our present moment, which means, my friends, that we cannot understand the way out of the present moment. I want to sort of go on to getting into the real theory here. I just wanted to let everyone know where we are with that. But basically, the early 20th century's American dream, right, seems to be dead for us in the 21st. Whereas our parents or even our grandparents could work a union job in a factory, support their family, and experience a life of genuine stability, those entering the workforce of the USA in the 2020s have no such future in front of them. As the American standard of living rapidly declines, they look backwards at lives of happiness, comfort, and stability in the cul-de-sac, and forwards to the stark reality of low-wage menial service labor and crushing debt in the trailer parks in inner city as the gentrified hipsters force them out of neighborhood after neighborhood, smiling condescendingly from behind ironic mustaches and $3,000 bicycles. The working class of today, this working class, is not the same as those in the eras of the second and third revolution. It's not the same as those in past revolutionary eras in other countries. It's not the same as the original industrial proletariat that Marx described arising. Don't get me wrong, these forces exist in the USA today, of course, as there's always some of that old thing left over when the new thing becomes dominant, right? But there's been quite a lot of history since the industrial age, and we're in a higher stage of the imperialist stage of capitalism in the 2020s. Given that, how could they be the same, right? The conditions and relations of production that produced us in the proletariat are simply different from those existing in large scale in the USA today, further mystified by the consolidation of finance and deindustrialization. And that, my friends, is what we must discuss in order to answer that big question. Because it is this force currently rising in contradiction to the decay of finance capital that brings with it our new era. If Marxism teaches us anything, it teaches us that change happens imminently from within the existing order's own internal contradictions. The contradictions of production become the contradictions of society. This change has happened in the US just as it happened everywhere else. We've witnessed the eras of chattel slavery, of industrial capitalism, of Jim Crow and the segregated middle classes, giving way to the Black freedom struggle and the political revolution of the Civil Rights Movement. As this history happens, we've been slowly witnessing the actualization of the American people as a people and watching as the revolution in technology of computers, the internet, and now AI change everything, creating a surge of what's often referred to as the PMC, or professional managerial class. We've seen financial institutions destroy, excuse me, we've seen financial institutions destroy our productive economy and the rise of the service economy, all those good union jobs replaced with working people forced to smile and take abuse from every Karen in the neighborhood just to bring in enough money to scrape by. This is now. And this is how our modern toiling masses reproduce social relations, degraded to the level of smiling robots, doing work a computer could do, stuck there due to machinations of financial elites that they mostly don't even realize are connected to their circumstances, who knowingly pop economic bubble after bubble, robbing the proverbial and literal bank on the way out. Now we're entering the new era of American history, the era of the decline of imperialism, the era of reproletarianization. This is sort of getting us ready to understand what reproletarianization is, right? I want to thank everybody who's sending super chats and super stickers. We'll get to those after we're done with the class. I just wanted to let y'all know we see you, we appreciate it, we genuinely do. I do see a few really cool questions though that I'm gonna pull up and we're gonna discuss as a class. How do you guys feel about that? You for it? All right, here we go. Cottonmouth NF is asking, reproletarianization, is that when you get rich and then become poor? Reproletarianization, Cottonmouth NF, is the death of the middle classes. As we'll sort of go through in this class tonight, the working middle classes arise as a special sort of creation of imperialism. And then their death, their whole lifespan is, part of it, right? The contradictions of society. And what we're seeing now is the people who lost proletarian character being re-proletarianized. Thank you very much for that question. So what did everybody think of the description of how society is functioning today? Do you guys think that's accurate or am I crazy or what? Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's very accurate, and you can kind of see, in some of the things that have transpired since COVID, the death of that kind of working middle class. I was listening to a podcast today, sort of totally unrelated to this, and it was an aside that drew my attention, but sort of the change of a place like New York, where you had these families that own kind of family restaurants or little businesses, those things being shut down because of COVID, and the character of establishments there changing and kind of being ruled by larger capitalists and developers now. So you can really see in specific situations how that middle class is dying away in different aspects. And I think COVID was kind of an accelerator of that.
That's a really, really good point. I want to sort of focus on how Marxism views the middle class for a moment, because that made me think of it. A lot of times we sort of have this trouble with the distortions of language that sort of piled up on us that I mentioned in the intro, right? During the last period of American history. So middle class, as used by the ruling class, is just an income bracket, right? You're either lower class, middle class, or upper class. But for Marxism, the middle is instead something outside of that contradiction between bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? So the peasants who had accumulated a lot of land in pre-revolutionary Russia, they were a middle class, right? They weren't in that contradiction, but somewhere in the middle between the two, always trying to go up, but always one step away from falling down. Now, what we're going to learn tonight is how the working classes, the working mass, the proletariat and the professionals join this middle class because of imperialism, right? And this creates a new form of middle class that history had never seen before. And as we're learning in this class, right, we need to be able to do our own Marxist analysis, because Lenin wasn't around for this, right? Marx wasn't around for this. And that's why there have been no real answers from the Marxist perspective on this to date. Go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize, I remember when when we first talked about this, maybe almost 2 years ago now, my initial thought was like, why is re-proletariat necessary? Why can't we just talk about like these people have been um they've regained their like proletarian character or something? And the problem is that when something undergoes that sort of transformation, it never ends up just in the same position. There's always unique characteristics to it. And the reproletariat has unique characteristics that if we don't understand them both at the material level and at the level of social consciousness, we're not going to understand the phenomenon, the relationship that they have to the working class, the contradiction that they exist in, more specifically with finance capital. And if we don't look at like, if we don't take like a scientifically rigorous approach to these developments and see them not just like, yeah, we're all exploited, oppressed, let's come together and overthrow the ruling class. That's good, and for agitational purposes, that's true. But we should be a little bit more rigorous in our class analysis and in our understanding of like the changes in the relations of productions, the developments of classes into, spaces where a section of the working class has been bourgeoisified, as Marx and Engels would say, or turned into like a middle class, which is what happened here. And it was a significant portion of the working class. Like we used to boast about our middle class being literally half of the population. There's some textbooks where you'll get that middle class literally means that part of the population that's in the middle. And in being in the middle, it should be constituting half of the whole population, somewhere between poor people and richer people. So this was a conundrum that Marxists had to deal with. Like, how the hell did the middle class develop? There were some people that took it seriously. A lot of people, I think, in the Marxist-Leninist movement didn't do as good a job as we could have in understanding its development. And now we're seeing its fall. And what Noah's project allows us to do is give a Marxist understanding of its development, of its fall, and how that clarifies the horizon for us today and forces us to sort of rethink things, not in ways that are, fully different from the past, but in ways that incorporate essential elements from past analysis, but adapts them to a new form that they have to take to be in line with the differences. And part of the analysis that I know you guys have received with this class and with whatever other education in Marxism you've had is that capitalism socializes the production process, right? That's one of the most central things that it does. Well, now capitalism is developing a gig economy, and it's individualizing workers and making them into kind of like these Leibniz monads that are radically disconnected from each other, but somehow they function in a way that's still harmonious with the production of profit for the rich. And there's specific techniques that are used that weren't used before, like you have in California Prop 22 passing that makes these gig workers instead of employees, instead of having them be listed as employees, they're listed as independent contractors. That's a form of class warfare, right? And if we can't understand the machinations of like, what's this new part of the working mass? We can't understand those battles. We can't understand the contradictions, and we can't understand our world or how to move forward. So I just want to reiterate how important Noah's analysis is.
Thank you very much, brother. I appreciate it. Everything Carlos said is very, very true. These are the things that we really need to understand. Go ahead, Emily.
I was just going to say, Noah, your comments about reproletarianization and the disappearance of the middle class, it just reminds me of the idea, and Carlos kind of touched on it, the middle class doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's like the circumstances, the material circumstances are such that it's essentially disappeared, but this idea remains that it's a thing. It's almost like a false consciousness. Just, from the late 60s on, we know that overall wages don't keep up with costs of living. We know that that's been true. And at the same time, concentration of wealth has increased. So we have a small number of people with way, way, way more, while there's everyone else with a lot less, including a whole lot more people with, close to nothing. So, the idea of middle class doesn't really mean anything because, as Carlos mentioned, it's almost everyone, like half of the population. The rest of that is mostly the just absolute poor, and then a tiny little percentage people that just have more and more wealth accumulation. I think that was all I meant to say.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good addition. In some of the research I'm doing for this theory, there's a thinker named Rodinger, and this is sort of his view that the way middle class is used in our society is a form of false consciousness, right? Especially as it dies out. And it's important to separate how we're taught to use it sort of in news media, etc., and a Marxist understanding of what a middle class is, right? Something outside of that contradiction. If you remember from all the past weeks, this sort of middle arising, right, out of these working masses can lead to that false consciousness, right? So they're connected rather than it being one or the other. It's both and.
I think also the message that what's good for business is good for the middle class. Like a lot of economic policies, it's sort of like, oh, if it's good for productivity or GDP, it's great. But really the middle classes, the average people, are the ones that are hurt the most by the policies. Yeah. And that are, hurt in multiple ways by the financial policies.
And those policies are part of what leads to their destruction, ironically, and to reproletarianization, which is the reproletariat is going to be something we have to focus on going forward. But to go back there was a reason that Marx originally focused on the proletariat, calling it the ingenious soil of mankind, because of two things, right? First, as the productive forces of that era advanced in the feudal era, they outmoded the relations of production, right? As the bourgeoisie became dominant, it created its contradiction, the proletariat. That class fulfilled the newer forces of production arising in direct contradictory existence to the bourgeoisie, meaning that the interests of one necessarily harmed the interests of the other, though the old thing depended on this contradictory relationship for its existence as that thing, right? Second, Marx's scientific study of this class, the proletariat, and its social relations led him to the conclusion that its development carried with it the future of humanity. And not even in the way the bourgeois class had before it, but in a much greater way, in the possibility of the overcoming of the class divide altogether. This was the first nascent class in history, or like the materially progressive class, right? That class whose relations of production and material interests necessitate a new social order more advanced than the one before. But it's the first one in history that was not a small minority of people. Production advanced to a point that it produced the first class whose interests lay not in the few repressing the many, but in the many repressing the few of the old exploiting classes so as to overcome their own exploitation, which necessitated overcoming exploitation altogether, right? This puts the proletariat in a place where its future becomes the future of the human race. And man, oh man, that's a lot of responsibility. So I'm kind of glad the Re-proletariat's coming along to shoulder some of that burden. Go ahead, Ed.
Going back to your original question on why we never saw a true socialist movement here in the U.S. I know from my standpoint, having for over 60 years not known anything about Karl Marx except what I read in the common literature of my day, which was mostly libertarianism, and he was usually misquoted, and all that. So, but what I've noticed, and this I'm going to try to tie in a lot of things. I apologize. I find myself at times when I go on Facebook, and I'm thinking about getting off Facebook because it's an absolute waste of human attention. People will say things, and I want to jump in and argue with them. The old Lazarus goes back in, into the death clothes. For those of you who know your Bible, you know what I'm referring to, and wants to fight in the old way, not the dialectic materialist way. So, and I think that is so true with so many people, that even embrace what little truth they grasp about Marxism, and they don't know, they come out of liberalism or whatever. So they stay in that whole mindset, that whole argumentative mindset, rather than engaging people where they are. And I think one of the things I'm looking at today is the whole Jason Aldean song. And as a father of African American children, little Mr. Tight Jeans there, skinny jeans, pisses me off to no end. He's a shithead, and he has absolutely no talent compared to our boys, Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings, people like that, who actually, their testicles have dropped, et cetera. Sorry, ladies, but Jason Aldean is a piece of shit. But I'm not going to get into the shouting match with all these people about, and then I'm going to point out, the 2 people were lynched at that courthouse, and that proves it, because I'm not sure that that's Marxist argumentation. That's I don't know enough yet. So I've just shied away. I had a good buddy. Oh, what a great song. And I'm like, you know what? I just kind of put him on the back burner. I didn't defriend him.
Let me interrupt real quick. That's a terrible song, just objectively. It's pop wearing a cowboy hat. Give me John Prine any day. Give me Conway Twitty.
Yes.
Give me some real country, okay?
Oh, Conway had a great voice, boy. Okay.
Yeah.
But I want to share one more thought, because I've been stewing on this for about a week, and it goes back to the same thing of how do we approach dialectics when we are largely ignorant. Now, we had a few weeks ago where we talked about, this whole thing of the purity fetish, and America just sucks, and some of us still hold a lot of that, but there's a group, and I'm not trying to call anybody out. I mean, if some of you support them or whatever, I'm not saying, I want your opinion on this, Noah. There's a group called RevComs, I think. And I've seen a couple videos of the lady who heads them up. And I mean, she seems like she's solid. I mean, she's got argumentation, and I'm like, and it all makes sense. And then one of their videos I happen to click on, and I see a couple young guys, RevComs, and they take an American flag and they put it down on the ground and they step on it. And then they start telling everybody that's around them how horrible America is. And nothing they said is false. Everything they said, I said a hearty amen. But my problem was if you've studied brain construction, you got your, what people call lizard brain, your primitive brain back here, which is fight, flight, survival mode. You know, I went to the doctor today to get my DOT physical because I'm going back to work. And he said, just breathe normally. You know, that's impossible. When somebody tells you to breathe normally, you can't do it because your frontal cortex says, breathe normally. And your lizard brain back here is going, what's that mean? You know, and it's a battle in your head to try to breathe normally. And I found myself doing that. So anyway, I said all that to say these guys standing on the flag, as much as I've always supported the right to burn it, to do whatever, even when I was in the military, they pissed off virtually everybody that was there. And as soon as they pissed them off, we all know, because I was a social worker, that if you get angry, you can't think. That's why everybody tells you, take a deep breath, count to 10. You're calming yourself so you can think about what you're going to do or what's going on or whatever. And the tactic, and I just think that there has been a long history of that. Hey, we're radical Marxists and we're going to piss on the flag and we're going to do everything. And oh yeah, we're going to really make those guys angry.
Yeah. And, I know exactly what you're talking.
Thank you.
I know exactly what you're talking about, brother. I actually mentioned something similar in the intro to this, and that's ultra leftism. And what it is they're not Marxists, right? And I don't want to go into particular organizations. We don't really do that here. But if anyone's saying America is evil, they're not approaching it dialectically, right? They're not viewing the society that we're in through the contradiction that it exists as, right? So they see all of these evils that, yes, is America, but they don't see Martin Luther King Jr., right? They don't see Du Bois. They don't see Eugene Debs. They don't see the building of the CIO. They don't see, integration, like all of these things, the progressive struggles that I often look at it like this. MLK wasn't Russian. He wasn't Argentine, right? He wasn't Somali. He wasn't Cuban. He was American, right? And if we remember what Stalin was teaching us in dialectical and historical materialism, it is that aspect of a thing which is developing that represents the future of that thing, which is the essence of that thing. So MLK, therefore, at this time, during the Civil Rights Revolution, represents what America is. The soul of America is embodied in MLK because he represents what became the future, right? What is becoming the future. The actualization of the American people, where we are now post-civil rights movement, and Jim Crow and segregation and all of that represents the old decaying order that us within the progressive forces are here to give the boot to. Now, if they can't understand society in this contradiction, in this struggle, then they are not approaching the question as Marxists. Now, as to the second part of your question, how we deal with sort of people who are under misconceptions about people like Jason Aldean, right? This always goes to how we should conduct ourselves as communists. And always, we approach in good faith, patience, and strength and knowledge of our convictions, the strength that learning the things you guys are learning in this class gives us. Because when we learn and take to heart and go over the things we're learning in this class, we can explain why the people that were stepping on the flag are not Marxists, right? And all the people that are fans of Jason Aldean are thinking that's what Marxists are, right? But if we show them this better thing that can genuinely lead the way forward, then all of those wrong ideas can begin to fall away, because really, at its heart, all working class people, and the remnant of the middle class isn't really a big deal anymore, but all working class people have the same material interests. So therefore, we can win that support from any corner, and I do it all the time. The real stumbling block are people who lie to people and say they're using Marxism and aren't, right? I know we're getting like way off in the weeds here. We got a lot to go over tonight. So go ahead, Sam. Let's keep rolling.
I'm just reading something I put in the Zoom chat as Wade requested, but it's exactly what you were talking about with essentially issuing a blanket condemnation of America is evil. It was really easy for myself to fall into this trap when I was in a period of time where I was solely studying American foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to study American foreign policy and not have that blanket, I can't say that word, condemnation, at the ready. But when you start to study, like, for example, I was reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which has some Red Scare here and there and all that, whatever. When he talks about how, yes, the police were brought in to sometimes kill striking workers, this, that, and the other, that story included those striking workers. For you to just issue that blanket statement of America is evil is to include those striking workers. And so what I said in the chat is America is both the working class agitating and the ruling class reacting. To say America is evil is to blindly condemn the efforts of the working class. Although what the ruling class does is easily attributable to evil, which, when you get into those terms of evil, you can kind of get into the idealism and theological terms, this, that, and the other. But for me, that was a big turning point where it was, you have to look at the classes agitating, revolutionizing, and then those classes reacting, and you have to take those into a totality, into a sum, however you'd like to phrase it. You can't just take one in isolation and speak about that one. So it may be more of a matter of having more precise language and saying that what the ruling class does is evil. I would still make that more precise than that, but that's just a starting point.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Tiva, go ahead.
Destructive is a good stand-in for evil. Like, destructive sounds good. Good. Yeah, sorry. By the way, sorry.
Go ahead, Tiva. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Tia.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. Because I have a question about, I think Ed was mentioning about, he was talking also, that the United States never had a true socialist movement. But wasn't the Black Panther and Martin Luther King and all that Marxist movement? So
yeah, I think he just misspoke. Really, what we were saying in the beginning was that we haven't had a socialist revolution yet. I think he just misspoke is all. And speaking of you, Ed, we got this really cool comment in the YouTube that I want to read for you, brother. Elizabeth Poirier says, hopefully I'm assuming correctly, that's so cool you went from libertarian to Marxist. I have libertarian friends. I'm trying to microdose with Marxism. Keep at it, Elizabeth. I've gotten everybody I work with on board for revolution and for socialism just by explaining the misconceptions. So I thought that was pretty cool. Go ahead, Starbuck.
Yeah, just kind of piggybacking off like the latter part of the discussions. In Iran, there's a famous chant of sorts when it comes to America, and that's Marg Baram Rico, which means death to America. And quite often, the leadership, including the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, has to specify that when we say Marg Baram Rico, we don't mean death to Americans, we mean death to American foreign policy, which is the key thing. So, yeah, like Americans, hardworking, love their country, want to see their communities built up. That's the common goal for everybody. And yeah, so when it comes to the evils of America, as we've kind of discussed here, that includes just a small section of America, which is the ruling class, and the foreign policy, which is attributed to them and them only.
Yeah, you can thank you for that, Starbuck. That's very, very helpful. You can really see where they're coming from, right? How they interact with an entity called America is not how we do as revolutionary American workers, right? They see imperialism, and it's really that's why the death to America chant is this entity for them, right? Death to this, and they specifically make sure they say it's not the working class there at all. It is how we experience what America is for us, which is not us, right? As in y'all and me. One last thing before we keep going. Go ahead, JB.
Yeah, just to jump off of what Esteban said, as a Black person in the United States, it's actually a lot easier for us to say that and get heads nodding saying yes, America bad, because of what has happened to, for instance, my people. And so it's also a means of knowing your audience when it comes to what you say and how you say it. If I'm in a group full of white people, I'm not necessarily going to say America bad. I'm going to be expressing my disdain for the ruling class that uses them to be lackeys so that they see other people who are different, so then they cause us to have a division. I may be a little bit more looser around Black people because we all know, and we have been under the thumb of what the ruling class has been putting us under as second-class citizens in that country. So I also will just want to add to your point that it's knowing your audience and knowing that, we think that, not necessarily saying America bad, but saying that, the people who are at the top are using other people by going against different marginalized groups in order to keep that division there. This is something that I also include, and whenever I, on my channel, is that you're either being oppressed or you're being used to be an oppressor. Whereas in reality, we all can come together and fight against the ruling class that is using us to really make money off of us and take resources away from us, basically.
Thank you very much for adding that, JB. That's important. And we're going to get to a few things on this and the color line shortly. But I'm going to keep going with a sort of reading a few excerpts, because what I really want to focus on is this contradiction that the U.S. and every other class society in existence exists as, right? All things are in contradiction, in a process of that contradiction developing to its revolution, to the negation of the negation, right? And so between the working class and the ruling class, there are certain necessary outcomes of that relationship in the era of the industrial proletariat, based around the production of what Marx called surplus value, right? Because it's surplus value, or the value that human labor embeds within a commodity that's over and above all of the value that it took to create it. That's the crux of the problem and the contradiction. This process and the necessary outcomes it produces is essential to what the proletariat is. In dialectical jargon, these are universals, right? We went over universal and particular. These universals arise within the proletariat in every particular instance in which it arises. They're the results of the general laws of societal progress that Marxism itself discovered. The greatest of these, and what we're going to be focusing on for our look at the rise and fall of the American middle classes, is this. The progress of generalized commodity production reduces working masses, which previously had a more stable way of life, peasants, for instance, with a communal way of living and stability in their connection to the land. They were thrust out of that stability, right? Kicked off the land in enclosure movements and privatizations and forced into the cities to toil in factories for wages. So they're reduced to a level of what we call social reproduction. Marx goes to great lengths in Capital to explain how this industrial proletariat, as it develops, is physically incapable of accumulating enough wealth for that previous stability. Engels does as well in Anti-Düring, and the pamphlet that we went over, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. The contradictions between the classes inherent in the system, the way value is produced in order for capital to accumulate, simply can't function any other way. We can't really reproduce Marx's Capital or Engels' Anti-Düring here and now, of course, but we can point out the central factor in this process and the scientific center of exploitation, the creation of surplus value. This relationship with the proletariat pretty much mathematically incapable of getting ahead is what reproduces society and creates social relations and social consciousness. Or, as Engels says, with constantly increasing swiftness, the splitting up into large capitalists and non-possessing proletarians went on. Between these, instead of the former stable middle class, an unstable mass of artisans and small shopkeepers, the most fluctuating portion of the population now led a precarious existence. Or, if we want to put it in easier terms, the proletariat arose as that class of people that developed the necessity of the expansion of the bourgeois class and bourgeois mode of production, and was thrust into a role of working paycheck to paycheck, unable to afford even the oldie-timey equivalent of a $500 emergency. Between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, even the formerly stable middle classes were living precarious lives due to the changes in production on an inevitable route to the same place. Sounds familiar, don't it? Now, the relationship with the owners of the means of production is another important aspect of this, right? The industrial proletariat arose as a class because the forces of production had advanced to a point where commodities could be mass-produced in factories, meaning hundreds and thousands of workers all labored together, all selling their labor power to one enterprise. In our era, we've advanced so far beyond this that the original singular factories and workshops of the 19th and early 20th century, they seem almost quaint, right? Excuse me. It's no longer one factory that we talk about, but an entire apparatus. This relationship of socialized production and privatized profit forms the material basis for the creation of the proletariat. It also leads to the major issues of capitalism itself being contradictory, right? But let's get off of that for 1 minute. What I really want to focus on is before this arises, how it arises, because it affects it and what it looks like, and then the creation of the middle classes. The history of racialized chattel slavery particular to the US, right? Which really is the central economic pillar of all industrial capitalism, arises out of. And just by the way, there is a focus on steam power, which was important, but fueling the British Empire's textile mills with cotton was the center of all world trade. Anyway, it was chattel slavery that truly laid the foundation for industrial capitalism, along with the associated industries of what's still referred to as the Cotton Kingdom for a reason, right? Anyway, this is the material premise. Everything that came afterwards gets built upon. We're not going to cover it in like broad detail or in detail, but basically just give a broad overview. You'll have to wait for the book for the details, right? But there is a historical reason that it was the black freedmen that arose as the vanguard of the proletariat during the era of the Second Revolution, Reconstruction, which was the first dictatorship of labor in modern history and lasted much longer than the Paris Commune. Take that, French, right? USA. Anyway, more importantly for our purposes here, the particular form of class struggle that arose out of this history, the Black freedom struggle, has been the primary mode of American class struggle throughout most of its history. Remember, universal, in particular, the universal class struggle can arise in multiple forms in the same society. This has been this primary form. Other forms were prevalent, especially the communist and trade union movements of the early 20th century. But this, the Black freedom struggle, was the form of class struggle that was primary during our country's most revolutionary eras. And if we look into the Marxist view of how a people becomes a people, things start to click into place. The American people weren't the American people in these previous eras, right? To quote W.E.B. Du Bois, who's the father of American Marxism, the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. That color line divided us as a people from the very beginning and held us back from our continual development as a people, stagnating our actualization in the real world. The power of bourgeois interests and economic necessity keeping us that way, creating an entire ideological trajectory based around race and racism. Class interests and class relations are, after all, the material basis for social ideas, right? It was chattel slavery as an institution, going all the way back to the British Empire erecting this institution, that lays the groundwork for American apartheid, Jim Crow, for racism, for so-called race science, and all the rest of it, creating that primary form of class struggle. But struggle America did, because we can't do nothing but struggle, right? That's what happens. In fact, most of American history, the American trajectory, as we call it at the Institute, can be viewed as the struggle of the most advanced sections of the proletariat against these divisions, striving to bring the masses into motion, the class struggle to become an equal people. As sovereignty, as a people is a material prerequisite for everything else that follows in society, though that's not often how we consciously think of it. And there were large sections of the actualizing American people that were denied that sovereignty. As Marx himself teaches us, labor in the white skin could not be free, while in the black it was branded. It is important to note that Marx was not making a moral statement here when he said that. He wasn't saying that labor in the white skin shouldn't be free while in the black it's branded, but that it cannot, that it is systemically impossible. Du Bois strengthens that sentiment when he speaks of class struggle in terms of democracy, saying there can be no perfect democracy curtailed by color, race, or poverty, but with all, we accomplish all. He may not have put it in Marxist jargon, but this is Du Bois' recognizing that all struggles are class struggles, that we share a common interest as working people, no matter what the color of our skin may be. And this class struggle, which represents the long process of the American people becoming ourselves, is American history when we view it from the Marxist perspective. All things arise as contradiction, with one end dying away and the other coming into being. This is what the national nihilists rampant on the modern so-called left miss. This is what the people that Ed was talking about miss in their empiricist and absolutizing mistakes of ideology, in their purity fetish. It is always both, with the new overcoming the old, and therefore containing the essence, that whole core essence of the entire thing within it, right? As a sprout bursts forth from a seed, we don't call that a plant of that plant a seed anymore. In fact, we see instead that the plant had been immanent within that seed all along. And it is the plant that is the essence of this thing rather than its seed form, which is now decaying in the ground while we get to eat delicious, strawberries. It's a strawberry plant. So what? Before even the founding of the Republic, there was the abolition movement. John Brown's legendary guerrilla campaign, the Civil War, in which the enslaved black working class amassed a great general strike and went over to the side fighting the men who dared call themselves owners. And whether the Northern soldiers who became their comrades were comfortable with the idea or not, established before the world not only the freedom of the black proletariat, but its very humanity. And that was only the second revolution this country has seen. The third was a political revolution, right? Led by the only civilian in American history to have a national holiday in his honor, Martin Luther King Jr. This great movement of the proletariat changed the basic social relations of the USA forever. Before it, the social norm was overt racism, right? Segregation, Jim Crow. Now, after this political revolution, the primary social relation of the working masses is one of, when not openly anti-racist, is at the very least neutral, and not one of overt racism and separation. Not that there aren't pockets here and there of the old ideological white supremacy. There are, right? Just as in all things, remnants of the old forms remain as the new becomes dominant. But in 2023, the American people are less racist than ever before in our history, more ready to stand up to the ruling class on these issues than ever before, more the American people than ever before. Look no further for proof than the largest protest demonstration in our country's history. After the state murdered George Floyd, a black man, uprisings and riots broke out all over the country. They broke out in metropolitan and urban sectors of cities, in suburbs, in rural areas, in places that had never protested before. There was a demonstration at a rundown old shopping mall in a mostly white suburb of my city, even. All because the state apparatus that is still concretely unjust to the black community was responsible for murdering one of our own. The importance here is that no matter what community we're talking about, George Floyd was considered one of us, a poor working class American. The American people feel this intuitively, right? In our era, there's a unity between communities that's never been seen before, not in the entire history of the country. That is the American trajectory. And that, brothers and sisters of all races, creeds, genders, and everything else, is an amazing feat no one would even have thought possible before the civil rights movement, no matter what the bourgeois intelligentsia tells us with every hip new bourgeois theory they push onto the left. And so to the question of judging the USA by its past, with all of this class struggle that has happened, with analysis of the American trajectory, How can we possibly freeze it in time or only view one part of the contradiction? Martin Luther King Jr. did not immigrate to the USA. Like we were saying before, right? He wasn't from Russia or Argentina. He was grown from the soil of the American people. He came directly out of the pulpit of a Baptist church. He was just as American as Jim Crow was. These two things, they're both inherently American. One doesn't stand outside the other, just as the bourgeoisie does not stand outside the proletariat. The classes represent parts of a whole phenomenon. The deciding factor is that King represents the progressive aspect of the contradiction, the one that progresses in relation to the decay of the existing and seemingly more powerful at that time aspect, whereas Jim Crow represented that old decaying order that was overthrown in his political revolution. And the American trajectory follows the same laws of development that all class societies follow. The laws that Marxism itself discovered, the laws we've all been learning over the last 9 weeks. So, back to our big question. Why have we not had a socialist revolution in the US? Well, the first reason was that our working people were divided. We weren't one working class, but different sections divided by the social relations that arose out of the productive forces of the day, set up and enforced by our ruling class that put them atop those the relations of production, separating us. And so class struggles arose that overcome this. Our second reason, though, that takes a bit more explaining. It's the problem of the middle classes. And the middle classes and their formation is related directly to the color line. So it's a good thing that we just learned the class analysis of the civil rights movement, isn't it? Before we go on to the middle classes and the problem of their arising, does anyone have any questions or comments or anything they want to add? Wonderful.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the thing that you spoke about a little bit earlier regarding about George Floyd being one of us. I said the exact same thing on my show earlier today. So great minds think alike. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, brother. Now speak for yourself. Great mind is a little big of a word to describe me. Mind, I guess. But thank you. I appreciate it. But I always say this to JB because he's always like, oh, I'm just learning this. This guy is so intuitive. All this stuff that's taking me like 20 years of study and like diving deep in dusty old Marxist tomes. He's just like, oh, no, I get it. I'm like, well, thanks for making me feel stupid. But it's true. George Floyd was one of us. That's why everyone was pissed off, right? In the 60s, that would not have happened, right? In the 60s, George Floyd would have gotten lynched by the cops and nobody would have cared. Well, people would have cared, but the masses would not have cared. We weren't there yet, right? And we're there now. And that means something. And it really drives me crazy when people minimize that, because people fought and died to get us where we are. King was assassinated by the state. Fred Hampton was assassinated by the state. They were murdered, died for this class struggle to get us where we are, to get us to the possibility of fighting for socialism. And if we don't honor that, we don't deserve to call ourselves communists. Go ahead, Kyle. Sorry to go up on a rant.
No problem. I had a pretty narrow question. I like the framework and of the Reconstruction as the Second American Revolution, the third the political revolution of the mid 20th century. So I was just wondering where that comes from and where I can do some further reading. I mean, it's pretty obvious, like industrial development in the South versus in the North and things like that. The impact that those eras had on American history, and I'd just like to know more and do some more research.
Yeah, the revolution, for us, for the Institute, and our focus on the creation of American Marxism is directly from Du Bois. If we were to redo the heads of Marxism, it will be Marx, Engels, Lenin, Du Bois. So that comes out of Black Reconstruction in America, but Marx was saying the exact same thing at the same time, and this is before Du Bois's explicitly Marxist turn, by the way. Marx was calling it a revolution. There's a really, really good collection, and I might have it on my shelf right here. I don't want to have to search. There's thousands of books over there. There's a collection that international publishers did of Marx and Engels on the Civil War, and it's everything they published, which is like 10 different pamphlets and articles from the newspapers Marx was writing for, as well as letters between the two. And it's really funny to see Marx chiding Engels for being too focused on military matters, because Engels was a good military tactician, believe it or not. And he was constantly talking about the tactics they were using. And Marx is like, brother, you got to realize these tactics are all depending on labor, right? And this is the key to it, right? This is why Du Bois calls the uprising the general strike, because it was the enslaved proletariat creating a general strike by rising up and crossing the line or killing the people that called themselves owners, etc. Go ahead, Kyle. Or Sam, I'm sorry.
I thought it was Kyle was next, or did you just ask your question?
He just did.
My own question.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just had a quick question, and it's okay if this is dismissed as being off topic, but I had a question about Peter H. Clark. I recently read this pamphlet. Oh, my screen is blurred. That's not going to help anything. I know this is flipped, but it's called Socialism, the Remedy for the Evils of Society, and it was written in 1877, which is very early on in the history of Marxism. So I was just curious if that was just something that.
And he's an American, right?
Yeah. He gave this talk at. He delivered a speech on July 22nd, 1877, to a crowd of striking railroad workers who were part of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. At that point, the largest national confrontation of labor and management in U.S. history, where he essentially gave the case for socialism. So think about Einstein's Why Socialism, presented way back in 1877 to striking railroad workers. It's considered one of the earliest pieces of American Marxist literature. I was just curious if that was anything somebody had been aware of.
I personally was not. The people to ask within the Institute about that would be Mitch or Carlos. They both have like a pretty big focus on early American utopianism. It's just not really in my wheelhouse, but it sounds awesome. I'd love to hear more about it later on. I think, though, that it reminded me of something, and now that fell out of my brain, so I apologize. Go ahead, Tiba.
Hi. So I don't know if it's also pertinent or not, but so we're talking about how before the middle class, how it changed, how it has changed. And so in the 50s, we had all that American dream and all that propaganda of how great it was. And I'm not American, so I don't know, but the impression that I have is that it really was better than it is now. and that's what you're talking about, reproletarianization. I'm wondering if the fact that if the bourgeoisie how do I say it? Like, I know it's not that simple, but if this has any truth to it, that because the bourgeoisie doesn't want the people to like to grow too much. So when people start getting better salaries and living, they comes a recession. And so I was wondering, did they allow it to get that good because they were trying to counter the USSR and how the living quality of life there was good, was better, was and
Yeah.
and there was so many social like revolutions, movements around the world, and they didn't want the people, the Americans, to realize, oh wait, they got it better. We could have that. So they kind of allowed the middle class to do that. But now, since there's no big huge socialist like the USSR country, they don't need to do that, and that's why the middle class is kind of very different from the 50s and 60s. Is that it, or
well,
that...
you know, it's funny. I was just talking about how JB is very intuitive. You're just as intuitive, because this is what we're about to get into, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, and just to give you a short gist, that's part of it, but it's
Okay.
not all of it. It's a combination of things, but all of it is from class struggle. They need imperialism to arise to even have the accumulated capital necessary to take such losses, right? Otherwise, it would have been a collapse or a revolution. But with imperialism, there's that basis of capital. There's super exploitation. So the monopolies forming can just handle that much more. And then there's local class struggle here. The Communist Party at the time was incredibly powerful. The CIO, which is still in existence even after all of the anti-communist laws, was built by the Communist Party because, basically, to make a long story short, the AFL was racist. And one of the big factors, and this is coming out of Du Bois as well, is that a lot of the segregationists and such would talk about how the black proletariat, or slaves when they were enslaved, needed to stay that way in order to keep their wages higher. But as Du Bois explains, that getting these working class people together actually leads to a higher standard of living for all. And this is one of the reasons that, sort of, even if we don't think about it on a moralistic note or on a whole Marxist everything encapsulated note, just from a more like cold economistic note, it's in the interest of all working class people to unite and fight together. That's why the CPUSA slogan was black and white, unite and fight. And racism chains everyone, because it all keeps us chained to the boss. So a lot of the big struggles within the communist movement and the union movement were against racism, and it was the Communist Party that led to desegregated unions. In fact, the Communist Party is the first integrated political organization in the entire country, which is pretty cool. But we're going to get to all this in detail soon. I just want to say one last thing on it. The existence of the USSR is absolutely part of it. Also, that the USSR was kind of funding our party. Go ahead, JB.
Yeah, so I just wanted to also include on your explanation to Tia's question. When you think about especially what happened during the Great Depression, there was pitchforks and torches at the door, right? Pitchforks and torches were like, hey, you guys ruin our country. We're going to either give us concessions or we're going to take it over. And so this spooked the ruling class. And so they had to give some concessions or do that, what I like to call a pressure release valve, in order for them to keep capitalism in place. So what ends up happening is they let that out, right? That pressure out. And so part of that pressure release was, the huge influx of the middle class going into the suburbs, all these different things, right? And so this is when the American dream started happening. But now, because we've had this move of wealth transferred to the middle class, now these corporations are going, now we want it all back. And so this is now the time that they're clawing it back. They're saying, no, we want all this wealth back. And so now we're going through the same thing again. However, their greed will be their hubris. And this is what's going to lead to something else coming up. Right, Noah? This is going to lead to another huge influx of class consciousness, but their greed is going to not allow them to concede again because they don't want to concede again. And so what's happening now is all of us and our happy smiling faces are in this class learning about class consciousness so we can teach this to other people. So then when an actual revolution happens, we have told everybody about, look, this person's white, this person's black, this person's trans, this person's is an immigrant. Look, we're all workers. We need to band together and actually have a government for us, by us. And so that's what's happening. And the thing is that a lot of us are now, realizing this, boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and then now Gen Alpha, they're all coming up to it. So it was really just a pressure release so that they can stave off the pitchforks and torches. That's what it was.
1000%. It functioned as a pressure release. And I want to say that it's not possible again. The way the financial system works, they need these debts. And with the dollar sort of shrinking, it lessens it. It's a whole thing that we're going to get into. So anyway, we're going to go right into the next section, which is how the middle classes develop, right? The sort of period we're talking about, the early 20th century, it was a time of great change, right? Not just in the US, but in the entire world. We saw the First and Second World Wars, the rise of the first worker state and socialist society of note, the expansion of capital to heights it had never before been able to attain in its progressive stage. And maybe most importantly and most overlooked, we saw the rise of the working middle classes, a new phenomenon in history, the special creation of imperialism, just as the development of the industrial proletariat was the special creation of industrial capitalism. It's this development that made it necessary for us to go over the basics of what class was above, right? And that contradiction between bourgeoisie and proletariat. Because as we said then, if we're stuck just memorizing the conclusions of Marx or Lenin or whoever, then we're unable to apply our own Marxist analysis and therefore unable to account for changes in social relations after they died or that they didn't study. That's why we're always looking at contradiction and motion. Contradiction and motion. This, unfortunately, has been an issue for American communists from the beginning. With a few notable exceptions like Du Bois, we've been an excellent example of the double-edged sword that is American pragmatism. Which is sort of an integral part of the particularity of the American people's social consciousness. It comes from the whole sort of building up forces of production out of a pioneer phase or westward expansion, etc. Anyway, that's not important for right now. Taking strict leadership from the Soviet Union is what this produces. And it was expedient It produced amazing benefits, but it also had very negative effects. Even setting aside the massive problem of things falling to pieces as the Gorbachev question arose, then those pieces scattering to the wind with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there had been theoretical problems all along. Namely, one of dogmatically following whatever it was the Soviets were saying, which could do nothing but stagnate our own theoretical development. It's for that reason that we only now recognize Du Bois as a genuine inheritor of Marxism that he was. And for that reason, that there's so much argument and confusion right now regarding the second half of the 20th century in the US regarding class relations as technology advanced to the computer age, and regarding class in general, really. To once again put it in the words of Engels, what all these gentlemen lack is dialectics. And that prevented American communists and other socialists of the past from understanding the rise of the middle classes in their form particular to 20th century imperialist powers, and specifically, in our case, the USA. There were simply no conclusions of Lenin or Marx or Engels for us to memorize, right? And many of their conclusions, because of the theoretical issues we've had, have been misinterpreted anyway. The class relations of the Soviet Union, they were completely different, so they didn't have any answers for us. So we were left without theoretical guidance, right? A boat without a rudder, mostly because this had never happened before, which makes sense if we base our analysis on motion and history, right? The creation of the working middle classes is a phenomenon we need to understand in order to answer that great big granddaddy of a question that we asked an hour and a half ago. This is why we needed to really understand the essential characteristics and basic outcomes of the proletariat relationship and explain the errors in thinking about it. For if the proletariat is the revolutionary agent of bourgeois society, as Marx's own self teaches us, why does this question even come up? According to the teachings of Marx, we should have had that socialist revolution in relation to its development, right? And by the way, it's this question and the errors we explain that leads people to mistakes, such as the overemphasis on what Lenin called a labor aristocracy, right? Or the labor leaders and movements who were bribed by the capital centralization made possible with the advent of finance capital. They tend to expand this to cover all the working masses and speak of the working classes of the West as a labor aristocracy in relation to those countries suffering under the boot of our ruling class. In defining class by its empirical and one-sided relation, it can't grasp the loss of the proletarian character for large sections of the Western ruling working classes, right? It just defines it rather than seeing that contradiction. So for them, it lumps all wage workers into one mass, right? Forgets the contradiction and falls into what we call empiricism, rather like a cartoon character slipping on a banana peel. It's an accident, but come on, you should have seen that one coming. Really? Anyway, Marx lays out via the dialectical method, right? In many places, by the way, but very concisely in Capital One, during the section on the secret of so-called primitive accumulation, he explains that the form property generally took before the advent of capitalism, individual property, the property of the small proprietor, had within it the embryo of its own negation and transformation into a higher form of property, that of bourgeois private property. We saw this process take place as capitalism came into being, right? And so the old form was negated by that new one. And as individual property advances and our powers of production along with it, it creates the seeds of its own negation, its own destruction, right? All that individual property was expropriated from individual producers, beginning its transformation into capital. This process then must happen again on a higher stage of development, negating that negation, right? Or in the much cooler way that Marx said it, what the bourgeoisie really produce are its own gravediggers. He explains the process happening in bourgeois society, and he says, that which is now to be expropriated is no longer the laborer working for himself, individual property, or the small proprietor, right? But the capitalist exploiting many laborers. This expropriation is accomplished by the action of the immanent laws of capitalist production itself. And an important note on immanent, right? We know the difference between immanent and imminent. Imminent is coming up next. Immanent is within the thing already happening, basically, inherent within it. Anyway, this happens by the concentration of capital. One capitalist always kills many. Hand in hand with this concentration or this expropriation of many capitalists by few, develop on an ever-expanding scale the cooperative form of the labor process, the conscious technical application of science, the methodical collective cultivation of the soil, the transformation of the instruments of labor into instruments of labor only usable in common. The economizing of all means of production by their use as jointly owned means of production of combined socialized labor, along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and discipline, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. Capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has sprung up and flourished along with it and under it. Concentration of the means of production and socialized labor, socialization of labor, at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. But what happens when, due to the steadily increasing changes within the economic base of society, or the development of imperialism and finance coupled with the tech revolution, instead of the proletariat expanding and experiencing the growth of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation, growing the revolt of the working class, the class struggle develops in such a way, and technology and finance develop in such a way, and capital has centralized to such an extensive point that the basis for this is available to the bourgeoisie without ruining it, that giant swaths of working people are able to force concessions and some amount of stability and the ability to accumulate beyond the means to simply consume the necessities of life. What happens when that happens? You don't get a revolution. That's what. The expropriators are not expropriated. Instead, you see the birth of a new form of middle class, the working middle class. Along with the advance in technology arising from computers, the expansion of the professional classes. And again, you don't get a revolution. Not yet, anyway. What you get is a temporary get-out-of-jail-free card for the bourgeoisie. Technology and the astounding amount of capital centralized in the hands of the cartels are able to be used to sort of artificially extend the life of this decaying class. Let's dig into that and what it means in the particular American context. But before we do, does anyone have any questions? We're really getting to the middle classes here and what reproletarianization is. Go ahead, Sam.
You're doing great, and I appreciate your teaching. Carry on.
Thank you so much, brother. Great's a big word. you know. But I'm glad you appreciate it. This theory's been sort of years and years in the making, and honestly, it's an honor to be able to even try to contribute to American Marxism. I mean, who am I? I'm just a guy that pounds nails in with a hammer all day, you know. Anyway,
AKA pressure release, Noah. That's basically what it was.
Thank you. In previous eras in other countries, the middle classes or the stratums of people within a society that are not part of its general contradiction, that stood somewhere between the irreconcilable antagonisms that creates class struggle, were not in economic sectors involved in the creation of surplus value production for industrial capitalists. Remember how essential that phenomenon is from the last section, right? Marx talks about them actually in his 18th Brumaire, explaining why these middle classes, and he explains actually that the bourgeoisie originally arose as a middle class, by the way, just fun fact. Why those, oh my God, excuse me. Why those middle classes see themselves as, quote, above all class antagonism. And so just so you know, anytime someone tells you middle class isn't a Marxist term, they don't know what they're talking about. Marx, Engels, Lenin, all these people use middle class all the time. Middle classes are what we were just talking about, right? Anyway, in Lenin's Russia, the middle classes were often the middle peasants or urban professionals and could include the bourgeois intelligentsia, whom Lenin referred to on more than one occasion as believing they were the brains of the nation, but were instead its shit. His word, not mine, though I am, after all, a student of Lenin, and I think our modern bourgeois intellectuals have roughly about as much to offer our nation as the 19th and 20th centuries Russian bourgeois intellectuals had. That is about as much as shit can offer, which isn't much. Anyway, here we see what is in the middle is not tied to particular characteristics. That's the main thing we need to understand. Nothing is tied to particular characteristics, right? Just as class can't be defined by particular characteristics. It's instead a general category, and the characteristics it may have in a given time or place are tied to the conditions, the historical epoch, and the society in question within that time and place. Here we're going to arrive at one of the primary criticisms of the previous era's communists in the USA, a lack of understanding how universals must concretize in particular forms, according to the material present within each particular form. This allowed the dogmatism inherent in American pragmatism to dominate, led to the mistakes of the second half of the 20th century in the acceptance of the secret speech, and landed us at the period directly previous ours, ideological confusion. In the USA of the mid-20th century, society was simply more developed than the earlier feudal epochs, right? So something much different from the peasants in Lenin's Russia or revolutionary France developed. A middle class arose and advanced for the first time in history from within the proletariat through a combination of militant class struggle in the US, the presence of the Soviet Union looming large in the East, and the capital accumulation and centralization from the advance of capitalism into its imperialist monopoly phase necessary to make it all possible. Large sections of the American industrial proletariat won important concessions from their bourgeoisie. It won weekends. It won the 8-hour day. It won the end of child labor, retirement benefits, and safety regulations. In a word, it won the empirical ground upon which stability could be built. The privatized product of production that developed along with the bourgeoisie was forced in part away from them in this way, and a few of them were socialized. This can occur, obviously, but because there is a much larger amount of capital than any singular capitalist firm could ever hope to have accumulated within each cartel. Maybe more importantly than all of this, though, those workers did not win political power. They won access to home ownership, but not all of them. We must once again remember here that it is the particular conditions present within society that determine the particular way things happen within it. The universals, like class struggle, must concretize in the real world their particular histories and particular times and places. This was the era of segregation and Jim Crow before the Third Revolution. The bourgeoisie was overtly white supremacist at this time, and the access to home ownership, there was the material stability desperately needed within the working masses of the USA, was forced away from them. But because of the material interests and ideology embodied within that section of society representing the old decaying order, the bourgeoisie, these concessions have particular characteristics of that section, namely of the overtly white supremacist bourgeoisie. That is, towards the continuation of the black working class as an underclass of American society and the proliferation of the color line. So while a significant amount of working people considered white now had access to government home loans and grants secured and safeguarded by the state, the red line of redlining was drawn so as to exclude the black communities of American people from home ownership and the stability that represented. I just want to point out the effects of that are still felt today. I'm from the east side of Cleveland. The east side is the black half. The west side is the white half. That's how it's been since that era, right? This affects us and the accumulated wealth, blah, blah, blah. Not a lesson on that, but it's still going on. But all that aside, it is stability that's central here, right? Stability and the accumulation of something beyond the reproduction of social norms and class society is the central factor that would make this large section of Americans essentially lose its proletarian character. With home ownership, working class, mostly white Americans were able to own something real, economically speaking, something more than enough to purchase things that are immediately consumed. More, it meant they were able to genuinely save up equity and wealth at times. It meant they had something besides their ability to sell their labor. This is the first part of the genesis of the American middle classes. As Marx explains in the fourth section of Capital, Volume 1, the way production itself is carried out always forces the proletariat down into the role of instability, mathematically unable to get ahead. The productive workers who were able to get homes saw an increase in their real wages, which is just an economic term meaning the pay one takes home adjusted for the cost of things. They saw an increase in their general conditions of life and were not constantly in fear of being thrust into what Marx called the reserve army, or losing their jobs and being unemployed. It lifts them out of this situation, however, for the reasons stated above. This takes them out of contradiction with the industrial bourgeoisie and begins the embryonic form of the contradiction with the financial bourgeoisie. They were still in contradiction with the boss, of course, but this stability, possible because of the massive amount of accumulation within finance capital, which made the enterprise and boss they worked for function in a different way, papers over that contradiction for a while. Sure, they're in debt now, but the debts were secured and regulated by the state, which had been forced to supply this stability in the first place through militant class struggle. This papering over begins the contradiction between the new middle classes and finance capital. As it's finance capital, the financial cartels, who control the lives of these workers on both ends, with control over the various enterprises employing the workers, because that's who the enterprises go to for investment, and directly through owning their various debts, which are assets for the financial cartels. This leads to the necessity of analyzing the process of the American people to use the old Hegelian term again, actualizing as the American people. What the racist form of the creation of the middle classes did was give a shot in the arm to bourgeois mythology within the sections of working mass for whom this rise to stability was possible, specifically based in what Du Bois called the American assumption, or the notion that no matter where one begins, if we work hard, we can achieve a better life and improve our circumstances. Now, the American assumption is a lot more than that. That's a very vulgarized form, but for our purposes, that's really what we need to know. At the dawn of industrial capitalism, this illusion, this American assumption, maintained legitimacy through the advance of the American productive forces and the building of basic economic infrastructure. In this era, the dawn of the middle classes, being able to own homes and take care of a family on a single salary did the same job for those losing their proletarian character. This is the same stability seen by the vast swaths of peasantry before the advent of industrial capitalism outmoded the old relations of production and proletarianization began, right? That's the stuff that goes way back to what we learned from Engels in Utopian and Scientific. As this process continues, we see the computer revolution, which changes just as much, if not more, economically speaking, than the steam engine and printing press had for industrial capitalism. As the American ruling class solidifies itself as the single greatest imperialist power on the planet, new technology creates what we used to call globalization, allowing the ruling class to spread its tendrils to every corner of the globe, intensifying the national contradictions between our ruling class and the nations it has made subordinate and dependent upon it. There are, again, hundreds and thousands of books written on this as an economic process, and I'll let the experts explain financial imperialism, how it differs from old colonialism, because they can do it far better than I ever could, though I will recommend for everybody Michael Hudson's Super Imperialism and Radhika Desai's Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy, to really learn how this works, both its whole process and specifically in the modern day. What we're concerned with here in this class and in the whole theory of reproletarianization it is not the international contradictions of globalization and modern imperialism, which Radhika Desai's book will explain in detail for you, but instead the birth, life, and death of the Western middle classes, the last of which is occurring in the present era. Now, we're about to get to the PMCs, or professional managerial class. Does anyone have any questions before we go to that? Keeping in mind that we're running at 2 hours right now, and I don't think we're going to have time to finish this whole thing tonight. So if it's okay with the class, we're going to do a reproletarianization part 2. So today's life and next week will be death of the middle classes, if everybody's good with that. Oh, awesome. All right. I think I already saw a majority vote. So does anyone have any? Go ahead, Sam.
I just can't believe you've been dragging this on for week after week, adding another week. So are we at 13 weeks now? I'm happy with all of it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, brother. Yeah. I'm not a very good time planner. I am incredibly punctual. You can ask Carlos about that one. I'm like to a fault. And what's funny is, like, before I met my wife, I wasn't. I was late to everything. That woman made me a better man. I tell you what, she really did. Like that, I'm cleaner now. It's because I want to make her happy. So it literally it's a long story. I'm a wife guy. Any chance I have to bring up my wife, I will do it. Anyway, any questions before we move on to the rise of the PMCs? All right, great. Actually, Carlos, if you're there right now, and I know you said you might not be able to talk, do you have any comments on extending the reproletarianization section to the rise this week and fall next week? Is that good with you?
Yeah, that's good with me.
Cool. Okay, so let's go into the PMC. Now, here's another thing. Anytime someone says, the PMC isn't a Marxist term, that's what we call dogmatism. Being so focused on a label rather than what we're actually describing is not Marxism. All right. Basically, if you're looking for like a sort of what is Marxism, almost everything you'll ever hear from people on the internet ain't it, whether they say they're for it or against it. Anyway, PMC is a really good term. I like it. So the rise of what's often referred to as the PMC, the professional managerial class, that's also tied to the computer revolution and globalization, actually. Professionals have always been a step outside the realm of value creation for industrial capital and the extraction of surplus value. Throughout history, lawyers, doctors, and the like have maintained a middling role in social reproduction, right? The new PMC joined their ranks, a special creation of our more advanced productive forces, and another stratum of working people that lie outside the realm of direct value creation. They perform mostly mental and managerial labor in offices, right? These people are the beneficiaries of the stability won in the previous era, but with the advance of technology, more and more they're needed in professional roles, right? As globalization / deindustrialization, because it has to be both, right? Automation and the productive capacity of automated industry developed far past the previous epoch. Education plays a key role here, as access to higher forms of education in universities and colleges expanded with the expansion of the middle classes, along with the notion that one needed to attain college and get a degree to achieve this middle class lifestyle, the American dream, right? The house in the suburbs, the 2.5 kids, the dog, the picket fence, all that. You know what I'm talking about. And so we see the working middle classes in both industrial productive sectors and the newly expanding professional sectors saving up to put their kids through college. We see young people working in the service industry to afford that education. Remember, we're still talking about the rise. This is in the past. And eventually, as financialization continues, we see the massive explosion of higher education as debt accumulation for finance capital. This oversaturates the market for these jobs incredibly quickly, driving wages down while the quantitative process of change within the imperialist ruling class continues on its shift towards financial speculation as the primary mode of capital accumulation. If we hit the fast forward button for a second, we arrive where we are today, with all but the highest rung of the professional classes completely soaked in debt up to their ears, few job prospects, and deteriorating wage rates for the vast majority of them. Bright young people who went into incredible debt to purchase that education they were promised would help them live a stable life are forced into careers at Starbucks or Wendy's, asking every other exhausted reproletarian if they want room for cream or fries with that 8 hours a day. And this leads us into the current era, which begins in 2008 with the Great Recession. In order to really look at where American society is, where class struggle is, and in order to understand the way out of the continually escalating crises we find ourselves in, which is leading terrifyingly towards a possible nuclear war right now, making finding the way out absolutely mandatory for the survival of the human race, We must understand 2008 and the subprime mortgage crash as a tipping point for finance capital, in which it establishes its full consolidation and becomes the primary mode of capital accumulation for the ruling class. Let me repeat that. Speculation then becomes the primary mode of capital accumulation for the ruling class in 2008, right? The so-called jobless recovery after that has not been a recovery at all, but a rapidly escalating series of bubbles and crashes, a back and forth of the financial institutions creating policy to try to stabilize currency, which is part of the international contradiction, and finance, the national contradiction, and it's impossible to have those both at the same time, right? The fully financialized version of the general crisis of capitalism and the introduction of the process we call re-proletarianization, or the creation of a new section of working people who are thrust down into the same role of instability the industrial proletariat had been, unable to accumulate wealth or stability, unable to do anything but reproduce the social relations of the last period of history, which the forces of production are quickly moving past. This is the same essential outcome the rise of the industrial proletariat had, but in contradiction with the parasitic financial bourgeoisie, rather than the productive industrial bourgeoisie. And the rest of it is going to be the decline and reproletarianization. So we've arrived at a great stopping point for the night. Before we do, though, we've got a few super chats that I just want to read off real quick. This apolitical idealist says, and this is from a while ago at 5:30, $3,000 bike is an electric cargo bike, screw cars. Not sure what he's talking. Oh, when I talked about hipsters riding bicycles regular people can't afford. Roadside revolutionary with 2 pounds says Noah's on fire today. Thank you. For a second, I checked to make sure I wasn't actually on fire. I'm stupid. Apolitical idealist says communists did industrial sabotage in the early 1900s. Not sure what he's talking about here. He could be talking about, strike actions and stuff like that, in which case, yes, there was quite a lot of that. But that's what happens, It's a contradiction between ownership and us. That's it, though. So, did you have a question, Wade?
I was going to say, sabotage was actually an integral part of the labor movement back in the day. I know for a fact that Jimmy Hoffa employed a lot of it.
Yeah, you did not mess around with the Teamsters back then. You just didn't. You would get your knees busted in with a baseball bat. We're getting a good question or a good comment on the YouTube from Sean Moon, who says he thinks it's more accurate to describe the current situation not as reproletarianization, but rather as lumpenization of the American workforce. I can see where your head's at. Next week, I guarantee I will change your mind, because this is the same process as the rise of the industrial proletariat, but a higher stage of development with new forces of production and the relations of production outmoding it, creating the necessity of something new. To be lumpenized means your relations to production are lost, but ours aren't lost; they're changed. Trust me, I'll make you come around, Sean. I promise. Go ahead, Sam.
I had a question about the Midwestern Marx logo. Pardon me, I have hiccups right now. I know from my understanding of seeing flags in the area of the Soviet Union that, good Lord, that the latter half is representing wheat, which is kind of like the peasantry, the agricultural labor, goodness, and that the red star is the red star that flies. I'd like to think still flies over all of us. I think I read a book by Vijay Prashad. I think it's called that, literally, the red star flies over all of us, or something like that. So I was just curious about the logo for Midwestern Marx.
Believe it or not, the logo was developed before I began working for the Institute. So I can't really tell you. I know I like it. It's very Soviety in some versions, in others not so much. So if you're looking at the YouTube, like right up there, it's more, it's the gold and yellow. But behind me, that flag, the white, gold, and yellow, that's my favorite version. I like sort of unique things. Maybe that's a sort of me coming out of the individualism of punk rock in my younger years. But yeah.
No, I love it. Yeah. The book I was referring to is Red Star Over the Third World. Shout out to E-Star in our chat for clarifying that. Essentially about how the Russian Revolution was the best revolution ever. Sorry, my hiccups are doing me in.
Give me 1 second. Yeah, so I think that's gonna do us for tonight. I am very excited. I really wish I could have gotten to all of this tonight, but we would be here until it's 7:20 now. We'd be here until at least 10 o'clock going over the rest of this. Just want to let you know, like next week is when we're going to dig into how reproletarianization is happening and why it's reproletarianization. And it's this creation of a new class with new forces of production. Remember, as the proletariat arose, the steam engine had been built, the spinning jenny. What AI and the internet is compared to that is worlds greater of a leap. And this, of course, must bring with it change. Our relations of production are being outmoded by the forces of production. It's very possible that in the future, the boss-worker relationship won't make any sense at all for production to actually happen. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. I love each and every one of you in the class. I cannot wait for next week. Stick around, though, after we go off of the live stream, and we'll hang out for a minute. For everybody else, remember to like and subscribe. For real. We get throttled. We get shadow banned. That stuff is important. If all you got to do is click a little thumb icon and it really helps, I think it's worth it. If you want to help us out more, patreon.com/MidwesternMarx, or our Buy Me a Coffee, or the Selfie Store if you want to donate directly to this class, right? Which is being put on for you guys for free, because what's really important is getting the basics of Marxism out there. Beyond all that, what's important is that the working class educates ourselves, because crises are coming. Make no mistake about it. As we can do this Marxist analysis and see, if we are not ready, we will lose. That's all there is to it. We will lose. And we do not want to see the horrors of a new fascism in the US. Because what happens if we lose is the total oppression of the people. In order for them to maintain their hold on power, you guys don't need me to tell you that. Anyway, thank you so much. Have a great night. And we will see you next week at 5 p.m. on Tuesday. Bye, everybody.
injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.